Hi, everyone. I'm Vince Molinaro, and I'm so excited to welcome you to this episode of the Lead the Future podcast. My guest is Dr. Graham Scher, who is the CEO of Canadian Blood Services. He joined the organization back in 1998, really when it was in startup mode. In 2001, became the CEO, which he's done since, and he has led multi-year transformations over that period of time, which I'm sure we will dig into. So welcome, Graham. I'm really appreciative of you making time to join us today.
Thanks for the opportunity, Vince. Really glad to be here and to have this conversation with you.
Great. So let's start with 2020, an unbelievable year on many fronts. And as you have been leading your organization and your teams through the pandemic, and obviously your organization is in the thick of that in terms of just providing such an essential service from a healthcare perspective. What new insights have you gained from a leadership perspective as you've led your organization through this year so far?
Where does one actually begin to even answer that question? So certainly I think 2020 has challenged every notion and every paradigm that I personally held as a leader and that our organization held in terms of sort of charting its future. So I'd probably make a couple of high-level observations to get the conversation started, Vince. So firstly, I would say it's almost as if the present and the future are colliding. And what I mean by that is, and I'm sure this is true for many leaders and many organizations, I found that we had for ourselves a well-charted strategic plan. We were on an aggressive transformation journey for the next number of years. And we had these sort of ambitious milestones and roadmaps laid out of all the changes that we thought were necessary to make in a controlled fashion. And suddenly, a great many of those have been accelerated and time compressed, and we need to make changes somewhat similar to what we had planned even before the pandemic, but on a much accelerated timeline. So I'm finding that from a leadership capability point of view, from an organizational change point of view, this notion of the present and the future are colliding, and that we're having to address the immediate needs of the pandemic and sort of our plans for longer term transformation and seek to accelerate and reprioritize some of those. So I think that has posed for me personally and for our organization a significant leadership challenge. Leadership is about being comfortable to navigate in ambiguity, uncertainty, and to live with complexity. And all of those, in my opinion, are greatly amplified as a result of the pandemic. What was complex before is more complex now. What was ambiguous and uncertain before, and we can talk more about what that means for leaders, what was ambiguous and uncertain before, I think is even more uncertain. And I find that as a leader, I'm having to make decisions to evaluate future options in the face of even greater uncertainty than existed pre-pandemic. And maybe the last sort of headline comment I would make is I've always believed resilience is important. So personal resilience, what does it mean for me as an individual and as a leader, and organizational resilience, and how does our organization sort of keep going in the face of this endless barrage? And I would say resilience has become that much more important, both at a personal level and at an organizational or institutional level.
Yeah, and that is such a great point, and one of the things I've been seeing with other organizations that I'm working with, and it really echoes your point. So that kind of, I've never had anyone kind of position it that way, the present and the future kind of colliding in some ways, and I've had other organizations that have been working on priorities, like for example digital, and then all of a sudden overnight they had to go digital in order to continue. And it was taking years before, and then it shows you the power, how quickly we can change when we need to. I'm curious, what have you done to ensure that you and your team and the organization has maintained that sense of strong resilience, and as I talked about as well, even resolve? Well, what are the kinds of things you've done for yourself and for your teams?
Speaking personally, I mean, I've always tried to maintain a balance between work and life, between my personal, physical, and mental well-being and my ability to be successful as a leader. I've always sort of prided myself in paying attention to that. And I think it's just become that much more important. You know, on a very personal level, I actually started 2020 with major surgery. So I sort of came back from my recovery literally like the week the pandemic was called by the World Health Organization. So I've had to double down on making sure that my physical and mental well-being are in sufficient state of control, I guess, in order to do what I need to do as a leader. And as leaders in our organization, we've spent a lot of time talking about what that means for us as individuals and for all of the employees in our organization. This need to protect and preserve one's physical space, one's mental well-being, make sure people take downtime. And it was so easy in the first few weeks and months of the pandemic to just hunker down and work 7 days a week and work 18 hours a day because everybody was desperately trying, in our case, to protect the security of supply and make sure we could meet hospital customer needs and what have you of our critical life-saving products. We couldn't maintain that pace and that momentum, both as leaders and every single employee, right down to the front lines. And so for me, the personal resilience has been about recognizing that we're in this for the long haul. This is not a short-term crisis we're managing. And in fact, that was one thing that we talked about as an executive team early on. We said, this is not a 6-week or 2-month crisis where you can work 7 days a week, 18 hours a day and get through it. Recognizing the long haul required us to say, we have to make sure we give ourselves personal time, physical well-being, mental well-being. We've been really insistent, and we've demonstrated this as leaders, but really insistent with our workforce that they take their vacation time, that they spend time with their families and their loved ones. And of course, it's been made that much more difficult in the pandemic because you can't go away, you can't go do your favorite activity to sort of get a break from work. So people have been really challenged about how do they do that. So I would say at an individual level, it's all about mental well-being, physical well-being, and balancing the work requirements, recognizing that the pandemic has imposed huge added challenges and stresses at the personal level. At the organizational level, I would say for me, resilience is about we're going to make bets on certain things. We may get them wrong and we may need to reposition partway through a decision because the strategic bet we made may not be taking us where we need to go. That's okay. It's okay to make mistakes as long as you're sort of aware to them and you're able to respond quickly enough. So I'd say that's an important part of organizational resilience too.
You have a unique perspective as a CEO to be with an organization as long as you've had. And how have those changes, what insights did you get about leading that kind of multi-year transformation helped you this year in particular?
It's interesting, Vince, because I would say it's both helped and challenged me in a way, and I'll answer it this way. So where I think it's helped me as a long-standing CEO of an organization, and the journeys of transformation that I've led the organization through that you comment on, so I'm deeply familiar with our industry's challenges domestically, globally, sort of sector-wide. So I think I'm lucky in a way in that I really have deep insights and deep foresight to what the challenges are that our industry was facing before the pandemic and have been amplified by the pandemic. In a way, because I'm so steeped in the sector and the industry, there was a familiarity with some of the challenges that we are addressing now. And I was able to build on and leverage some of the significant changes we've made in the past. So, we've gone through various iterations and transformations over the past few years, and we could leverage those. The one I would use by way of example is, because we are a monopoly provider in the Canadian context, we have had very robust business continuity management capabilities and very robust redundancies built into our supply chain. So that was a huge help to us because we could leverage all of those for our pandemic planning and preparedness. We didn't really have to start from scratch. So because I've been in the organization for a while and have built up a lot of significant capabilities in the organization, we could leverage those very readily. I would almost say that as a long-standing leader, it's been a bit of a challenge, and I've had to push myself very hard and my organization very hard, is the risk of falling into paradigms that I'm very familiar with. So we've made decisions in certain paradigms in the past, and I always needed to challenge myself and challenge my team to say, just because those paradigms have been successful to us in the past, does it mean it will be successful in the current context and the current milieu of a global pandemic? And that's been a bit of a risk or a pitfall we've needed to be cognizant of, because the risk would be we actually make decisions the way we've made them successfully in the past, when you had the luxury of time and the luxury of non-pandemic decision making. I've tried to be sensitive to and cognizant of that and make sure that we're applying what in my view is a different risk paradigm and a different decision-making paradigm than everything we've done in the past.
So as you kind of look now to the future, I mean, my sense, and I think something you said earlier, is what I'm sensing from other leaders that I'm working with is that it's probably, whether or not it'll happen, it's actually good to assume and orient yourself that we're in this for the long term. The other thing I'm sensing, and I'd be curious in terms of your perspective, is that everything that we've gone through between, let's say, March to now has been challenging, but what's coming may even be more challenging for leaders and for organizations and their teams. What's your sense on that? Do you think you've got to even buckle down even more as a senior leader?
I think that's absolutely true. I think as complex and as challenging as things have been in the last 9 or 10 months, they're going to be that much more difficult for the next few years on several fronts. I mean, I'll obviously speak to my context, but I think it's probably applicable across many sectors and many organizations. So we're a publicly funded organization. We're a very large budget, very large, complex supply chain organization. But at the end of the day, we are publicly funded. And so one of the, I think, enormous challenges that we're going to face in our sector is that the environment of fiscal restraint is likely here for years, if not decades to come. Given what governments have had to do to simply get through the pandemic and to protect the economies and to protect societies and to invest in healthcare, governments have expended quite appropriately vast amounts of, unbudgeted dollars that, of course, we as taxpayers are going to have to be carrying for years and decades to come. So for me, in my organization and my sector, being aware that our future, where we have a lot of transformation that we still want to undertake, some of it driven by the pandemic, some of it even existing before, and how do we drive that level of change and transformation in an environment where our fiscal resources are going to be severely constrained. So I would say that's a challenge that certainly we're looking to in the future. And then, this is a trite statement, and all leaders are saying this today, but it is true. We are not going back to a pre-pandemic world. The question for me is, so what does that mean? Now is the time to start putting specificity on that notion that we all agree with. And so when the work that we're doing now is trying to put some real concrete evidence behind what that change is going to look like. I think it is true that the workplace, the workforce, and the work environment of the future are going to be radically different from what they were on March the 9th of this year. So yes, there's going to be more virtual work. Yes, you're going to have fewer people convening in the sorts of office environments that we're all familiar with. That's sort of the easy part in a way. For me, it's how do we create a contactless yet engaged and dynamic human environment on a go-forward basis. And so I think we're obviously struggling to to understand what that means in our context. And just for viewers and listeners, my organization, Blood Manufacturing, is our primary business. Our raw material, if you want, is human beings coming in and making a donation of blood or plasma or stem cells. That's a real challenge because human behavior, in my view, is going to be irrevocably changed as a result of the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And so what does it mean when my reliance on human connections, human interactions, people behaving in a certain way is forever altered? How do we bring our, and I use this in air quotes, raw material into our environment when their expectations of a contactless environment are radically different than what they've been in the past? So that's imposing huge challenges on us. And the one other I would make, which I think is highly pertinent to most industries, is supply chain resilience. The pandemic exposed, we all knew that supply chain resilience was important, redundancies have been important, but I think domestic supply chain resilience has become more important. We saw that with personal protective equipment in the early months of the pandemic. We're seeing it now with access to vaccines. Canada is not a country that's domestically self-reliant. And in my business, which is the manufacturing of blood and plasma and related drugs, we do not have sufficient domestic self-reliance in our supply chains. So how do we bring in that capability when for decades, we've all been relying on just-in-time global supply chains. And of course, that's not unique to my industry and my sector. But I think that's a future complexity that we really got to start getting to terms with pretty quickly.
Yeah, and so you've nicely kind of mapped out already the big issues, coming at us. But, that began with this sense of us thinking that we're going back to what we knew is really a faulty assumption and belief. And that's certainly something that even the term that we were hearing early on around the new normal, to me, implied in a very subtle way that we were trying to go back to something that we knew. And I think it's really accepting the new realities. And so, given the work that, we've done in the past, I'm always curious as to that kind of, the context in which leaders are leading. What is the strategy they're trying to execute against? And ultimately, what's the kind of leadership that's going to be required? So given as you're looking out to the future, what will you think will be the implications to your leaders in how they'll need to step up now and, over the coming months and even over the next year or so?
Yeah, in several ways. So I think for me as leaders, if we want to keep our workforce engaged and committed and able to drive the change that I think is ahead of us for the next many years, one is, I cannot emphasize this enough, is empathy, empathy, empathy. I think as leaders, we're going to talk about automation and digitization and contactless environments and all of that important stuff. But at the end of the day, it's about being empathetic to those whom we lead. And I think empathy is always important. I think it's a vital leadership attribute. But I cannot imagine that it's not going to be the single most important asset that we as leaders bring to the work that we do. How do we demonstrate empathy for those who we need to help us drive the change and those whom we serve? So I would say that's going to be a degree of leadership stepping up, if you want, that is even more important than it was before. This notion of, as leaders, we don't know it all. We have to be honest and transparent with those in our organizations and in our teams and the stakeholders who we work with, that there's a high degree of uncertainty out there. And acknowledging that, being honest about what we do and don't know, being honest that we're going to make some strategic bets that may or may not necessarily work out well. But to me, it's this sort of creating an environment where with our organizations, our teams, our team members, we can be totally transparent, totally honest with the things we know, and importantly, the things we don't know. And I think the pandemic has exposed us at a very personal level. We're all unaware of the future. We're all concerned about the future. What is the world going to look like in this post-pandemic environment? That's true at a personal level. Layer on top of that, when an organization says, I'm not so sure that my strategic roadmap is necessarily as valid as it was before the pandemic because of all of these new factors that have come into play. So I think as leaders, that's going to command of us a capability around honesty, transparency, vulnerability, where we sort of demonstrate to our organizations what it means to be leading in a time of uncertainty, yet doing it in a way, obviously, that motivates and galvanizes people. And none of this is new. You know this, and you've worked in our organization long enough. I just think we're going to be plumbing depths of leadership capabilities in ways that we haven't had to before, and dig so deeply into things like vulnerability and empathy and resolve. It's just going to be that much more important.
Yeah, I completely agree. So what's your sense on, because what I'm also finding now is I do believe that many organizations have understood the critical element of empathy. And as one organization, private sector, mentioned, well, we dialed up big time, in March and kept that going. And now as the fall came, there's this tension between, we dialed up the empathy. We gave our teams as much flexibility as they needed personally to do what was necessary. And we have an organization to run. And that tension between the empathy we need and driving performance. What's your perspective on that? How do you walk? Is it a fine line? Is it a duality? Is it a tension? How do you think about that empathy performance challenge?
It is a duality. I like that word, empathy and performance. It is a fine line. There is always a tipping point one way or the other. If you go too far on the empathy side and performance fails, you're not being very successful. If you drive too hard on performance at the risk of empathy or the expense of empathy, you're in big, big trouble. So I think we all recognize how fine that line is. For me, I think what the leadership challenge is going to be is that the line is going to shift. There are going to be points in time when I think the empathy quotient has to actually trump the focus on performance. And that may be at certain waves in a pandemic. It may be at times when schools go back. We certainly found that in our organization in September as caregiving employees. So employees who are parents, who have kids at school, or who are taking care of sick parents at home, or whatever the case may be. There were points in time in our journey over the last 10 months when we needed to dial up the empathy factor because the stress in the personal environment was that much higher. And a classic case in point for us was return to school in September. And then you sort of get back into a holding pattern, if you want, and we've been able to push a little harder on the performance. So I think it's the dynamism between those two, but I think they're always going to be in tension with each other. And I just can't imagine a future where we can drive so hard on a performance focus at the expense of empathy, because I don't think that's going to be sustainable in the long run. But we've got performance challenges, we and everybody else. We've got huge performance gaps that we now have to close. And so how do you bring those two together? And I think it's going to put a pressure on all of us as leaders for sure.
Yeah, and a lot of the work I know you've done is organizationally was really to strengthen your leadership culture and position it as strongly for some of the multi-year transformations you were undergoing. And how do you see that work now around leadership culture and what you'll need to do to make sure your leaders are as strong as they can be individually, and how they work together to address some of these pretty considerable challenges, not just today, but in the coming months and over the next year or so?
We've paid, very careful attention to developing a pipeline and a capability of leadership inside the organization. I'll admit that in the early months of the pandemic, we shelved a lot of that work, and we said, now's not the time to really focus on all these important skills of leadership development and pipeline development. But so we sort of almost set it aside just because we were hunkering down in crisis management mode so early. Maybe 3 or 4 months ago now, we began to say, okay, done with that, setting that aside now. Now it's even more important we, double down on our leadership development work. So we just recently sort of brought it all back to the fore, and we've re-examined all of the leadership development investments and plans that we had, obviously, a lot of it is going to be digital in the short to near future, virtual. So we're not going to bring our leaders together as we did a couple of times a year into these, big events for a few days, and you bring the whole leadership community together and you do these rich deep dives, some of which you've participated in with us. We're having to do these differently now. As an example, I host a leadership call across the whole organization, coast to coast, every couple of weeks, and we dig deeply with our leaders into conversations with a cadence and a frequency that we didn't before the pandemic, and that's been richly rewarding. But for me, it's identifying what the pipeline of leadership talent is that we need for this new reality that we're going to face, that is probably different than everything we believed was critical from a leadership capability in the past. So we've had to rethink some of our leadership capabilities and now develop a sort of leadership acquisition and talent development pathway to build these new capabilities. We're, as an organization, have right in the midst of the pandemic, because all the work around Black Lives Matter and systemic racism in society in Canada and the US and elsewhere, we're doubling down, more than doubling down, investing incredible amounts of time, energy, and effort in our diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy, because we believe it is that much more important now. It's always been important, but we're saying now is the time, because again, you have these collision of societal phenomena. So you have a pandemic, but you have all of these societal disruptions around systemic racism and inequity. And so we're saying we have to do a better job now. So we have a big body of work on bringing diversity, equity, and inclusion right into the organization at a much more deliberate level than we were before. So what does that mean for our leadership? Not just from a physical, an observable diversity point of view, but really from an inclusion and equity and capability point of view. And then the last point I would make, it's future-proofing our talent, our leadership talent, for this new reality. Again, I think we've got some incredible leaders in our organization. We've driven some very impressive change in the past that I'm very proud of. But now we need to ask ourselves, is that going to be good enough for the next future? So it's this sort of future-proofing our leadership capabilities and our talent.
You're absolutely right. I mean, the rethinking what leadership development looks like is going to be critical. Your practice of bringing your leaders together every couple of weeks is a powerful leadership development practice. You make leadership kind of top of mind. I love that kind of deliberateness around that and kind of fostering that sense of community and culture.
Yeah, and I've tried to judge the value, I guess, of these sessions. And it's, when you ask questions and you do surveys and you get responses. And, I would offer two observations. So one is, we're asking people to give up an hour. It used to be every week, now it's every 2 weeks, an hour out of their already beyond busy schedules. And we have not seen a decline in the number of participants in these senior leadership calls. So we have across the organization in 9 different provinces and territories, we have leaders in 36 sites, over 120 people, and we have almost uniform participation in every single call. So I judge that to mean it's important to the leaders out there. And then it's the engagement in the conversation, the rich dialogue and engagement that our leaders are having on critical issues. We might have a perspective from our virtual ivory towers in head office, but the frontline leaders who are really on the coalface of driving the change are bringing a set of realities and perspectives into our conversation. We also do organization-wide town halls using social media capabilities like Teams or Zoom or what have you. And we have, over 1,000 employees on every single one of these calls in a live Q&A with me and other leaders in the organization. And I think that just goes to show, it comes back to my point around empathy and leadership in times like this. And I hope we don't lose that, Vince, as we do enter into some sort of new reality. I hope it doesn't go away as something, that was necessary in the pandemic. We don't need to do that anymore going forward.
I think as we continue to re-enter, I think one of the drivers will be, employees and leaders themselves having a different way of working where they may start making their own decisions, right? Where your leaders might say, no, we're going to keep these going because I want to keep feeling connected. And I think those formats, even though they're virtual, really are also culture building opportunities. And I think people really do want to feel, I mean, you're such a purpose-driven organization anyways, and what you do is vitally important, and that rallies people together. But at the same time, given the pressures we're all facing, feeling a sense of, collegiality and mutual support, and knowing that, your leaders have one another's backs is vitally important today. And I'm seeing that in other cases. As you look at young future leaders, those maybe joining your organization in their early 20s or just, graduating, what words of wisdom would you have for them? Because they're kind of, entering their professional life in a pretty dramatic way. And what perspectives would you think is important for them to think about?
Yeah, that's such a wonderful question. And I think about that one often in two contexts. I look at my kids who are all in their mid-20s and, entering into their professional lives or finishing up their academic lives and thinking about their futures. And I look at my organization and we're trying to bring in younger, more leaders from more diverse backgrounds. And we're trying to sort of create this exciting future that attracts people, yet the whole environment is premised on uncertainty and lack of clarity as to what the future is. And there's a high degree of concern. I mean, I look at my own kids, I think they sort of, this anxiety around the future, politically, financially, economically, socially, everything is disruption and disorder. And here we are as older, senior leaders having to bring in new leaders into our organization and create an environment where they feel excited and energized to drive change, when I think a whole bunch of factors and circumstances around them are fighting against that. Today, you can't even bring them into the work environment. It's all being done virtually. So how do you create that sense of belonging, that sense of culture? How do you impart what it means to be a leader at Canadian Blood Services when all I'm doing is talking to folk on the other side of a 2D monitor? I think it's really difficult. And yet we're trying to say it's an exciting, dynamic future. Come join us because you can shape a degree of change that can have meaning for patients who depend on our products and services for years to come. So I think on the one hand, I really do believe it's an exciting future. I really do believe, despite all of the disruptions in society now, despite all of the socio-economic and political signals that are not fun, they're challenging. I think it is still an exciting time for organizations to drive change and an exciting time for leaders to sign up for that change. But I think that you can't just assume that. I think you have to be explicit and deliberate. As the older leader nearing a different stage in his career, I've got to be very purposeful, very deliberate in taking time with younger leaders, having these conversations, listening to their concerns and their anxieties, giving them credence and credibility, and yet trying to motivate and energize these younger leaders to the future. So I think it's going to be challenging. I think it's going to be fascinating, because if I can impart energy and enthusiasm and motivation to these younger leaders to drive a future that will be more resilient, that will be more robust and more able to withstand the shocks that we're facing now. That's going to be fascinating to watch from my rocking chair in decades to come. I'm motivated by doing that. I think it's going to be exciting to cultivate a talent and a pipeline of younger leaders, but I think they're going to bring with them some important anxietal issues that are driven by, in their 20s, look what they're looking at and saying, you left us a goddamn mess. And now you're saying, come fix it and shape the future. Thanks very much. One's got to actually give credence to that. I think one's got to listen to that and then hopefully motivate them to to pick up from where we're leaving our organizations and our institutions and saying, you guys can do better than us. And the future is exciting. I think the future is incredibly exciting, even though it's going to be of a very different nature, human contact, different nature, technology, a different nature, opportunity of a different nature. It's going to be fun, but it's not going to be easy. I think we shouldn't delude ourselves that it's going to be easy to do.
No, completely agree with you. Well, thank you so much, Graham. It's been such a great conversation. As always, your deliberateness, your thoughtfulness, and I really do appreciate the generosity of the time you've made to spend some time with me to really talk about how we lead the future. So thank you so much, and I wish you and your team continued success in the important work that you do.
Thank you, Vince, and thanks for all the work you've done with us over the years. I think we're partly where we are because of you and others like you that we've worked with. It's been a real privilege and a pleasure on my part, and thanks for this opportunity.
Great. Well, thank you for saying that, and all the best.
Take care. Bye.